The wind carried dust across the wide plains, where the sun burned down on weathered wood and dry earth. A small boy stood in front of a farmhouse, his shoes worn thin, his eyes lowered to the ground. His face was streaked with dirt, though it wasn't the soil that weighed on him most. It was the words still ringing in his ears, words from the man who had raised him but never truly fathered him. He had whispered them to himself on the walk down the long road, hoping each step might erase them. But they clung tighter than the sweat on his back. "My father said I don't deserve love," the boy cried softly, his voice catching in the open air, as if the sky itself might answer. No one did. Only silence stretched across the prairie, broken by the creak of a barn door swaying in the breeze. From the porch, a man and woman watched him. They had seen boys before, neighbors, sons, children passing through with families heading west, but this one was different. He stood alone, as if no one in the world had laid claim to him. His hands hung stiff at his sides, trembling when the man stepped forward. The woman's heart ached the moment she looked at his thin frame and the sorrow in his eyes. She had prayed for children once, prayed until her knees ached, and her voice had grown hoarse in the church pew. But years passed, seasons turned, and no child ever cried within her walls. The prayers became whispers, the whispers became silence. The man, hardened by work and loss, had long ago told himself he was content without heirs. Yet something about the boy's presence unsettled him. He had carried cattle through storms, buried friends on the frontier, faced winters when the food barely lasted until spring. None of it had stirred him the way those few words did. They cut through like a knife. "My father said, I don't deserve love." He glanced at his wife, and she looked back with eyes that spoke louder than words. She reached for his arm, steadying him, urging him forward. The man bent down, his knees cracking, and took the boy's small hand in his calloused one. He didn't speak right away, for he knew the wrong words could do harm. The right ones had to be earned. The boy dared to lift his eyes then. In them was something raw, like a wound too deep to hide. He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for shelter. He didn't even ask for kindness. He just waited, as if waiting itself was all he had left. The woman stepped closer. Her gray hair pulled back, her apron still dusted with flour from the bread she had been kneading. She placed her hand gently over the boy's other hand, and for a moment, the three of them stood in a fragile circle, bound not by blood but by something unspoken. Life in those days was unforgiving. The land demanded strength, and the towns were filled with whispers about who belonged and who didn't. Folks looked at children without families. The way they looked at stray dogs, pity mixed with suspicion. To take in a boy not your own was to invite talk, and talk could turn bitter quick. Yet as the woman held on to him, she knew none of that mattered. Her heart had been empty too long. Still, the man hesitated. His grip tightened on the boy's hand, and he studied him as one might study the sky before a storm. Could he trust himself to raise a child? Could he give him what had been denied? Behind him, the field stretched endless and dry, as if waiting for rain that might never come. The boy, sensing the pause, bit his lip and whispered again. He said, "I don't deserve it." His voice cracked. Not from hunger or thirst, but from something far deeper. It was the sound of a soul asking if it was worth keeping alive. The woman's throat tightened, and she whispered back, "Every child deserves love." But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of her husband's silence. She had known him long enough to read the storms in his eyes. There was a storm brewing now. The man finally straightened, letting go of the boy's hand only to place it firmly on his shoulder. "You listen here," he said, his voice steady, his words plain as the land itself. The boy's chest rose and fell as he waited, hope and fear fighting inside him. The woman held her breath, for she knew what her husband said next would shape the course of all their lives. But just as the words formed on his lips, a sound broke across the quiet plains, the thundering of hooves in the distance. Horses, fast and hard, drawing closer. The man's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening protectively on the boy's shoulder. The woman stiffened, her fingers pressing against her apron. The boy turned, fear flashing in his eyes, for he knew the sound too well. He knew what kind of men rode with such force and why they came. The porch creaked under the weight of silence as the riders approached, dust rising behind them like a warning. The boy's heart pounded. He wanted to believe this place could be safe, that these hands could hold him steady. But the past had followed him here, and it was closing in fast. The man stepped forward, his body shielding the boy, while the woman whispered a prayer she had not spoken in years. The boy clutched the man's hand once more, his small fingers pressing hard, as if clinging to the last chance he had. And in that moment, just as the riders came into view, the boy's words hung heavy in the air, unanswered still. My father said, I don't deserve love. Would this house prove him wrong? Or would the world show him once more that he was right? The answer lingered in the dust, waiting. As the hooves drew nearer, the riders came fast, the ground shaking beneath their hooves, the dust curling in the late afternoon sun. The boy's breath caught as he pressed closer to the man who had only just taken his hand. Fear had taught him silence, and so he said nothing, though his whole body trembled. The man's jaw tightened, his arm shifting slightly to keep the boy behind him. The woman on the porch pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, whispering another prayer as if the words themselves might build a wall strong enough to hold danger at bay. When the horses slowed, their shadows fell across the yard. There were 3 men, broad-shouldered and heavy with dust, their faces carved by sun and miles of road. They wore the look of men who had seen more fights than meals, men who carried trouble with them the way others carried tools. Their eyes swept the small house, the porch, and finally landed on the boy. One of them leaned forward in his saddle, spitting into the dirt before speaking. Thought I recognized that face, he said, his voice sharp as barbed wire. You runnin' from home, boy? The boy flinched, his small hands clutching the man's sleeve. He wanted to answer, but the words stuck like stones in his throat. He shook his head, then nodded, his fear too tangled to hide. The eldest of the riders let out a short laugh, one without humor, the kind that chilled more than the coldest wind. The man of the house did not move. He stood tall, though his years and labor weighed on him. His voice was calm when he answered, This here's my place. He's standing under my roof now. If you got business, you'd best be clear what it is. The rider's grin faded. His eyes narrowed as he glanced between the boy and the man. He didn't speak right away, only looked at the other 2 as if measuring the ground. Finally, with a tug of the reins, he spat again and said, We'll be back. The hooves thundered once more as they turned and rode off, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. Only when the sound faded into the distance did the woman release the breath she had been holding. She stepped forward, her hand brushing the boy's hair back from his forehead. They know you, she whispered. Though her words were more a question than a statement, the boy lowered his gaze, ashamed. He didn't want to speak of where he'd come from, or of the man who had told him he was unworthy of love. He feared if he said it aloud, the words would plant themselves in this house too, and grow until even these kind strangers turned him away. The man watched him carefully, the silence stretching. At last, he said, You don't have to tell us now. But someday, boy, you'll need to. The boy nodded, though his chest ached. For the moment, it was enough to feel the warmth of their hands and the faint hope that maybe he was not alone. As night fell, the farmhouse glowed with the soft light of a lantern. The woman set bread and stew on the table, her hands moving with the ease of habit, though her mind was far away, circling back to the riders and the fear in the boy's eyes. The man sat at the table with his head bowed, rubbing the ache from his hands. The boy, quiet and unsure, sat on the edge of the chair as though ready to run if someone changed their mind about his place here. The stew was simple, filled with potatoes, onions, and a little meat from the smokehouse. The boy ate slowly at first, then faster, as if afraid the food might disappear if he lingered. The woman watched with tears in her eyes, though she wiped them away quickly before anyone could see. She had dreamed of nights like this, quiet meals, small hands at the table, the soft sound of a child's breathing in the room next door. Yet now that it was real, she felt the shadow of worry pressing in. The man finally spoke, his voice steady though heavy. You're safe here tonight. But tomorrow, we'll need to know more." He paused, then added, "Those men will come back. They weren't just passing through." The boy's spoon clattered against the bowl. His shoulders hunched, and he stared down, his voice barely a whisper. "They know my father." The woman's hand stilled on the edge of the table. The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "And your father? Is he the one who said what you told us?" The boy nodded once, quickly, as if ashamed. His voice cracked. "He said I don't deserve love. Said I was a burden. He told them to take me away." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. The woman's lips trembled, and she reached across to grip the boy's hand. The man's eyes darkened, though he said nothing more. For a long time, only the sound of the wind rattling the shutters filled the room. Later, the boy lay on a small cot the woman had prepared. He could still hear the hushed voices from the next room. He knew they were speaking about him. He closed his eyes, wishing he could sleep, wishing he could believe this place might hold him. Yet deep down, fear lingered. He had been told too many times that he was unwanted. Could these people truly mean otherwise? The man sat by the hearth, staring into the flames. His wife touched his shoulder softly. "We can't turn him out," she said. He nodded, though his face was troubled. "I know, but we'll be talking on more than just him. Those riders still stir trouble. And whatever his father's done, it won't let go easy." The woman's eyes filled with quiet strength. "Then let the trouble come. He needs us more than we need peace." The man said nothing, only stared deeper into the fire as if searching for answers. Days passed, and the boy began to settle into the rhythm of the farmhouse. He fed the chickens, carried water, and helped mend fences alongside the man. Though his hands were small and his body thin, he worked with a determination that surprised them both. At night, the woman read aloud from an old Bible, her voice soft and steady. The boy listened, though sometimes he turned his face away when the verses spoke of fathers and sons. Yet the shadow of the riders never lifted. Tracks were found near the edge of the property. Once, smoke rose on the horizon where no one lived. And sometimes, late at night, the boy thought he heard hooves again, though when he peered from the window, only darkness stretched before him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in red, the man sat with the boy on the porch. He handed him a small piece of whittled wood, shaped like a bird. "Made this when I was about your age," he said. "Keeps the hands busy, keeps the mind steady." The boy turned it in his fingers, his eyes wide with wonder. "Did your father teach you?" The man paused, his face shadowed by the fading light. "No," he said quietly. "I learned alone." He looked at the boy then, his voice firm. "But you don't have to." The boy's throat tightened, and he clutched the wooden bird to his chest. That night, when the household had gone quiet, a sound came again. This time it was not just the boy's imagination. Hooves beat steadily on the dirt road, closer and closer. The boy froze on his cot, heart hammering. The man stirred in the next room, reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall. The woman's voice was low but sharp. "It's them." The man's boots struck the floorboards as he rose. The boy gripped the little wooden bird in his hands, his chest burning with fear. He knew the riders had returned, and with them the weight of his past. He closed his eyes, praying this house would be strong enough to hold him. But outside, the sound of horses grew louder, circling, until it seemed the whole world was wrapped in the echo of hooves. The night air was heavy, every sound sharper than usual, as though the earth itself was waiting to see what would happen. The riders had returned, and their horses paced just beyond the fence line. Circling slow, the creak of saddles and the low murmur of voices carrying across the yard. The boy's chest rose and fell fast, his small fingers digging into the little wooden bird the man had given him. From the next room, he heard the scrape of boots and the unmistakable sound of the rifle being loaded. The woman's voice followed, low but steady, telling her husband to be careful, though even she knew words would not hold back what was coming. The man stepped out onto the porch, the lantern light casting a long shadow. He did not raise the rifle right away, but it was clear in his stance that he was ready if need be. The riders pulled their horses closer, their figures looming against the glow of the moon. One of them, the same who had spoken before, leaned forward in his saddle with a grin that did not touch his eyes. "You're a stubborn one," he said, his tone mocking. "That boy don't belong here. You best send him out before trouble finds you." The man's jaw tightened, his voice measured and steady. "He's under my roof now. That makes him my responsibility. You got a quarrel. Take it elsewhere." The rider's smile faded. He spat into the dirt again, the sound sharp in the silence. "You think you can keep what ain't yours? You're playing a dangerous game, old man." From inside, the boy watched through the small crack in the window, fear gripping him like iron chains. He wanted to run, to hide, but his feet would not move. The woman stood near him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, though he could feel the tremor in her fingers. She whispered almost to herself, "They won't take you. Not from here." The standoff stretched until one of the riders let out a sharp whistle. With that, they pulled their horses back, the sound of hooves fading into the night. The threat lingered, though heavier than ever. The boy felt it in his bones. The certainty that they would return again, each time stronger, each time closer to taking him. The next morning, the farm seemed quieter than usual, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The boy worked alongside the man, carrying feed and patching fences, but the weight of the night before clung to him. He kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting to see dust rising again. The man noticed, though he said nothing until the sun was high. "They won't stop," he finally said, his voice rough but calm. "Men like that? They don't let go easy." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "But neither do I." The boy looked up at him, unsure what to say. He had never known someone willing to stand between him and danger. His father had sent him away without a second thought, and now this man, a stranger until days ago, had faced down armed riders rather than hand him over. It stirred something unfamiliar inside him, something that felt dangerously close to hope. In the evenings, the woman tried to keep life steady. She baked bread, hummed old hymns while she worked, and spoke to the boy as if he were her own. She told him stories of her childhood, of winters by the fire and summers when she'd run through fields barefoot. The boy listened, his heart aching with a longing he did not understand. He wondered what it would have been like if he had grown up in a house filled with warmth rather than harsh words. But as the days passed, unease grew. The riders had not returned, but signs of them lingered. A broken fence where no cattle had wandered, ashes from a fire in the woods, still warm when the man found them. The boy woke one night, certain he had heard a voice calling his name from the darkness. He pressed his hands over his ears, whispering to himself, until the woman came and sat beside him, singing softly until his trembling eased. One afternoon, the boy wandered to the edge of the property while the man worked the plow. He knelt near a creek, tossing small stones into the water, trying to calm the storm in his chest. He did not hear the footsteps until it was too late. A shadow fell over him, and when he looked up, one of the riders stood there, no horse in sight. His face was lined with dust and malice, his grin sharp. "You can't hide forever, boy," the man said, his voice low. "Your father don't want you, but we've got use for you." The boy's stomach twisted. He stumbled back, but the rider grabbed his arm hard. Pain shot through him and he cried out, the sound carrying across the field. The man dropped the plow and ran, his boots pounding against the earth. By the time he reached the creek, the rider had vanished into the woods, leaving the boy shaking and pale, his sleeve torn where the grip had been. The man knelt beside him, fury burning in his eyes. "Did he hurt you?" The boy shook his head, though his voice quivered. He said, "They got use for me." The man pulled him close, his jaw set tight. "They won't get you. Not while I've got breath in me." That night, the farmhouse was filled with a silence heavier than before. The woman wept quietly as she stitched the boy's torn sleeve. The man paced by the window, rifle leaning within reach. The boy sat near the hearth, staring into the flames, the wooden bird clutched tight in his hand. He wondered what it was they wanted with him. He wondered if his father had sent them, or if they had come on their own. As the fire cracked and shadows danced along the walls, the boy remembered more of his father's words. He remembered being told he was worthless, a mistake, a burden too heavy to carry. He had believed it then, but now, in this house filled with quiet strength and sorrowful kindness, he began to question. Could it be that love was not something earned or denied, but something given freely? Yet doubt gnawed at him still. If love was real, why had his own father thrown him away? Why did danger follow him like a shadow wherever he went? He curled tighter into himself, afraid that any hope he allowed would be stolen as quickly as it came. The woman, seeing the look in his eyes, knelt beside him. She placed her hand gently on his cheek, her voice trembling but steady. "You're not alone anymore. Do you hear me?" The boy nodded, though his heart was torn between believing and fearing. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of branches snapping in the distance. The man gripped the rifle, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window. He knew they were not safe. He knew the riders would come again, not just to threaten, but to take. And as the night stretched on, each of them lay awake in their own silence. Hearts bound together by fear, hope, and the storm pressing ever closer. The boy clutched the wooden bird until sleep finally took him. Unaware that out in the fields, unseen eyes watched the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. The days that followed were restless, every sunrise carrying with it the weight of uncertainty. The boy rose early to help with chores, his thin frame moving among the chickens and water pails, yet his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. The man noticed. He worked alongside the boy without saying much, but his silence was not indifference. It was the silence of a man who measured every threat and carried his decisions deep in his chest before letting them out. The woman tried to keep the house warm with routine. She baked bread, hung laundry in the wind, and sang while she worked, but even her voice carried an edge of unease, as if each note might shatter under the strain. The riders had not come in daylight since the creek, but signs of them lingered like ghosts. A fence cut clean through, as if by blade, tracks pressed deep in the dirt at the edge of the fields. And once, a rabbit left gutted on the porch. The message was clear. They were being watched, tested, circled. Each day without confrontation felt less like peace and more like a coil winding tighter. Waiting to snap, the boy's nights were worse. He woke often in the dark, clutching the wooden bird, listening for hooves or voices just beyond the window. Sometimes he thought he heard his father's voice calling his name, slow and mocking, though when he opened his eyes, the room was empty. The woman would come to sit beside him when he cried quietly into his blanket. She never asked what he heard, only smoothed his hair and told him he was safe. Yet the boy could see the fear she tried to hide, the fear that safety was slipping through their fingers. The man began to take precautions. He reinforced the doors, set traps along the edge of the property, carried his rifle everywhere, even when tending the cattle. He taught the boy how to whistle sharp and loud if trouble came, how to climb quickly into the loft of the barn where no rider could easily reach. The boy listened carefully, but inside, a deep unease grew. He knew these preparations meant danger was not just possible, it was certain. One evening, while the sun bled into the horizon, the boy asked the question that had weighed on him since the creek. His voice was small but steady. "Why do they want me?" The man didn't answer right away. He stood on the porch watching the fields where shadows stretched long and thin. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy. "Because some men don't care about people. They care about control. A boy without a home is easy to claim." The boy frowned, his chest tight. "But my father, he gave me to them." The man's jaw tightened. He turned then, meeting the boy's eyes. "Your father gave away something he didn't deserve to keep. That don't mean you don't deserve better." The words struck deep. The boy wanted to believe them, wanted to cling to them the way he clung to the wooden bird. But the sound of hooves in his memory kept pulling him back. He feared that no matter how far he ran, no matter who stood beside him, his father's shadow would always find him. That night, the wind carried a storm. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled across the plains, and lightning cut the sky into jagged pieces. The woman lit lanterns, her hands steady, though her eyes betrayed her worry. The boy sat close to the hearth, trying to drown the thunder with the sound of crackling wood. But even as the storm raged, there was another sound beneath it, a rhythm too steady to be thunder. Hooves. The man heard it too. He stood, rifle in hand, and motioned for the lanterns to be dimmed. The boy's heart raced as he pressed close to the woman, her arm around him tight. The storm masked much, but the rhythm grew louder, clearer, until even the boy could count the riders. Not 3 this time, but more. The ground seemed to tremble with their weight. The man moved to the window, his face set like stone. Through the blur of rain and darkness, he saw them. Shapes on horseback, circling the property, their lanterns glowing faint through the sheets of rain. They did not approach the house, not yet. But their presence was a noose tightening around the farmhouse walls. Hours passed, storm unrelenting, yet the riders stayed. The boy could not sleep, could barely breathe. Listening to the sound of horses moving, waiting for the moment they would strike. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, the fields were empty. The riders had gone, but their tracks remained. Deep scars in the mud, proof that they had waited all through the night. The days that followed became a battle of nerves. The boy grew quieter, speaking little, watching the door as if it might fly open at any moment. The woman tried to hold the home together, but even she could not ignore the weight pressing in. The man grew more restless, his patience thinning with each sign left by the riders. He was not a man quick to anger, but the kind who burned slow until the fire consumed everything in its path. One evening, as the boy sat on the porch steps, he heard the man speaking to the woman inside. The words were low, but through the thin wood walls they carried, "They want him for something. He's more than just a boy to them. Could be ransom, could be worse." The woman's voice trembled. "We can't let them take him. He's ours now." The boy's throat tightened. He pressed his forehead to his knees, his chest aching. He had always feared being unwanted. Now he feared being wanted for the wrong reasons. That night, the riders came again, not in numbers, but with a message. A single man rode to the fence, leaving behind a small bundle. Inside was a piece of rope and a note scrawled in rough letters. "Tomorrow night," the man's hand clenched around the paper, his jaw set hard. The woman paled, her hand pressed to her lips. The boy stared at the bundle, his heart sinking. He knew what it meant. They were coming for him. The man gathered his rifle, his voice rough as gravel. "We'll be ready." The farmhouse turned into a fortress. Windows were barred, lanterns readied, ammunition set in neat rows. The boy was shown again where to hide, but he shook his head fiercely. "I won't run," his voice cracked, but his eyes held steady. "If they want me, they'll have to take me from here." The man studied him, then nodded slowly. "Then you stay close." The woman tried to smile through her fear, brushing the boy's hair back. "You're braver than most men I've ever known." The day passed slowly, each hour stretching thin. The boy helped with chores, though his stomach was tight, food tasteless in his mouth. The man moved with grim focus, checking every corner of the property. The woman prayed quietly under her breath, as she kneaded bread. Though her hands trembled with each press of dough as night fell, the sky turned a deep red, as if warning what was to come. The boy sat with a wooden bird in his hand, his thumb rubbing over the worn grooves. He listened to the growing silence, the stillness that settled before the storm. Then, faint at first but rising, came the sound. Hooves. Not distant now, but close, steady, unhurried. The boy's chest tightened. The man lifted his rifle, his face calm but fierce. The woman stood at his side, her hand gripping the edge of the table. The riders came into view, their shapes black against the blood-red sky. There were more this time. More than the boy had ever seen gathered before. They spread wide across the field, encircling the farmhouse. Their horses stamping and snorting, the men silent as shadows. The leader stepped forward, his voice carrying sharp across the open land. "Send him out. Do it now, and we'll spare you." The boy's hand clenched around the wooden bird until it bit into his palm. His heart pounded, but he stepped closer to the man. Refusing to hide, the man raised his rifle, his voice steady, unshaken. "You'll not have him." The riders stirred, shifting in their saddles, their faces grim. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, every heartbeat louder than the last. The boy felt it in his bones, the moment before chaos. The fragile edge where everything could break. The woman whispered a prayer. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, and the boy clutched the wooden bird as if it could shield him. The night held its breath, waiting for the first move, the first shot, the moment that would decide everything. The riders sat in silence, their horses stamping in the dirt, the smell of sweat and leather heavy in the night air. The boy stood close to the man, his chest tight, the wooden bird pressing into his palm so hard it almost hurt. He could hear his own heartbeat louder than the storm of hooves that had carried the men here. The leader's voice rang out once more, sharp and cold. Last chance. Hand him over. The man did not move. His rifle was steady, his voice firm. He's not yours to take. He's mine now, the words hung in the air. Stronger than iron? The woman stood just behind him, her hands trembling, but her eyes unflinching. The boy felt their strength press around him like a shield. The standoff stretched long enough for the night to feel endless. Then, without warning, one of the riders urged his horse forward. The man fired, the crack echoing across the fields, and the horse reared back with a scream. The rest of the riders surged, shouting, their horses pounding the earth. Chaos burst across the yard as gunfire split the air, the thunder of hooves mixing with the woman's cries and the boy's own ragged breathing. The boy dropped low, pulling himself behind the porch rail. He clutched the wooden bird, praying the man would not fall, praying the woman would not be struck. Bullets tore through the night, sparks flying as metal hit wood. The man fired again and again, his movements quick but steady. The years of labor and survival in the wild sharpening him into something unshakable. One of the riders broke through the fence, charging straight toward the house. The boy froze, terror locking his limbs. But the woman stepped forward, lifting the lantern high, throwing the light into the rider's eyes. The horse balked, rearing, and the man fired clean. The rider tumbled from the saddle, the horse bolting into the darkness. The boy gasped, his body shaking, but something inside him stirred to something fierce and alive. He grabbed a stone from the ground and hurled it with all his strength at another rider, the rock striking hard against the man's arm. The rider cursed, his aim faltering, giving the man the moment he needed to fire once more. The fight raged long into the night, but at last the riders began to falter. One after another, they pulled back, shouting curses, their numbers thinning as they retreated into the open fields. The leader lingered, his eyes burning with fury, but even he knew when the battle was lost. He spat into the dirt, his voice low and full of venom. This ain't over. With that, he turned his horse and rode into the darkness, the sound of hooves fading until only silence remained. The man lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. The woman sank onto the porch, her hands trembling as she pulled the boy into her arms. The boy buried his face against her shoulder, his body shaking from fear and relief. For a long time, none of them spoke. The night was quiet again, broken only by the soft crackle of the lantern. When at last the boy raised his head, his eyes wet and red, he whispered, "You didn't let them take me." The man crouched down, resting his hand firm on the boy's shoulder. "And we never will," he said. His voice carried the weight of a vow, one that could not be broken. The days after the fight were hard, but different. The man buried the fallen rider out by the creek, marking the grave with a simple stone. He did not celebrate victory, for he knew men like those would not let go easily. But for now, the land was quiet, and the boy was safe. The woman returned to her daily work, though now she hummed with more purpose, her hands steady. She baked more bread, cooked bigger meals. Each night she set a place for the boy as if he had always belonged. The boy slowly began to breathe easier. He still woke in the night sometimes, hearing phantom hooves, but now, when he called out, the man came, sitting at his bedside, until he fell asleep again. The woman told him stories by the fire, stories not of loss, but of love, of how sometimes family is not given but chosen. One afternoon, while fixing the fence with the man, the boy asked the question that had lingered in him since the fight, "Why do you care about me?" The man paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked down at the boy, his voice slow and thoughtful. Because no child should be told he don't deserve love. That's a lie. You deserve it same as anyone. Maybe more. The boy's throat tightened, his eyes filling, but he didn't look away. He nodded, clutching the wooden bird that never left his pocket. In that moment, the words sank deeper than the hurt his father had left behind. For the first time, he began to believe that maybe he was not broken, not unwanted. Weeks turned into months. The land healed from the battle, though the scars on the fence and porch remained as reminders. The riders never returned, though sometimes the boy still feared he would see their dust on the horizon. The man told him not to worry. They've learned better than to test us twice. The boy grew stronger in those months. He learned to mend fences, carry water, and even handle the rifle under the man's careful watch. The woman taught him to read, her voice gentle as she guided him through the words in the old Bible and the few books they owned. Each night, they sat together at the table, sharing meals and stories, the farmhouse no longer silent, but filled with the sound of laughter and life. One evening, as the sun set gold over the fields, the boy stood with the man on the porch. He held the wooden bird in his hand, turning it over thoughtfully. "Can you show me how to make one?" he asked. The man smiled faintly, nodding. "I reckon I can." They sat together, the man's large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones over the knife and wood. The boy's cuts were clumsy at first, but steady with practice. The woman watched from the doorway, her heart full. She knew this was not just about carving wood. It was about carving a future, about passing something of himself into the boy's keeping. That night, the boy placed the new bird beside the old one on the small shelf near his bed. Two birds, side by side, symbols of something stronger than fear. As he drifted to sleep, he thought not of the riders, not of his father's cruel words, but of the warmth of the house around him, the steady presence of the man and woman who had taken him in. He understood now that family was not always blood. Family was the hands that held you when you shook, the voices that told you truth when lies had cut too deep. Family was the place where you found you did deserve love after all. The seasons turned. The crops grew, and the farmhouse remained steady against the winds. The boy grew taller, stronger, his laughter louder than his fears. The man and woman once bound by sorrow now carried hope in their days. They had not only taken in a boy, they had been given back the chance to love, and in doing so, healed wounds of their own. The land still held dangers, and life was never easy. But within the walls of the farmhouse, love had taken root. It was simple, hard-earned, and unshakable. And as the boy stood in the fields one morning, the sun warming his face, he whispered softly to himself words he finally believed. "I deserve love." The farmhouse seemed to echo the truth back to him, carried in the wind in the steady earth beneath his feet. And in the quiet strength of the family who had chosen him, the boy smiled, the wooden bird in his pocket, and walked back toward the porch where the man and woman waited. Their lives forever bound together by choice, by courage, and by love that could not be taken away.